right, start the recording. Perfect. So, welcome everybody. My name is Suzanne Sorrell. I am the Associate Dean and the Director of the Graduate Music Therapy Program at Molloy College. And Molloy College is located in Rockville Center, Long Island, New York, in case anybody doesn't know. But some of you do know because you are alumni or current students, and we're very happy to see you. This is a very special night for us because we're kicking off our alumni workshop series with one of our esteemed alumni, Dr. John Fessenden, who's been working as a music therapist since 2014 and is now an assistant professor at Mississippi University for Women. Dr. Fessenden is a music therapist, a researcher, and an educator. And his most recent clinical work has been focused on children and young adults with developmental disabilities and many on the autism spectrum He has certification in Nordhoff-Robbins music therapy and neurological music therapy. And his dissertation was on autistic musicality, the history and theory, and 2 case studies exploring how sensory, cognitive, and emotional differences among autistic people affect musical experiences and performances. So this is a very interesting topic tonight. So I think we're all really anxious to hear about autistic hearing. I don't think it's something that there's been a lot of research about. So you're really on the cutting edge, John. And we're so happy to welcome you back to Molloy for this presentation. So thank you for coming. And I'm going to give it over to you. I'm going to just pin you and you'll take it away. Thank you, John.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction, and it's great to be back at Molloy, even albeit virtually. So, you know, any way we can do it, that's fine with me. So yeah, and I'm happy to share this presentation. So, anyhow, the title, as you see up here, Autistic Hearing from Music Theory to Music Therapy. It's going to basically a description of, you know, what we'll be talking about today, but it also is, I guess you could say, it references where I'm at in terms of my current research and, you know, where my sort of progress is at this time. As Susie mentioned, I graduated from Stony Brook, and my research was really in the field of music history and theory, right, or musicology, and other universities will call it, but music history and theory, musicology, and this concept of autistic hearing is something that has been brought up in music by music theorists, and my sort of my dissertation, what the bulk of it you'll hear about tonight, is kind of grappling with some of these ideas that are put forth by these music theorists, and then trying to think as well about, you know, providing a sort of critique and revision of the theories, and then trying to think about how those are applicable to music therapists. What's their clinical significance? You know, why is this something that we should be you know, interested in and following? So that's kind of what was the project right now. So anyway, here we have our learning objectives. So participants will identify extant theories of autistic hearing as described in the scholarly literature. Participants will identify which cognitive and perceptual differences common among autistic individuals impact listening to music. And then participants will identify examples of how autistic hearing can lead to development of specific musical skills and/or preferences. So there we go, the learning objectives. And this is going to be the outline. So first, just discuss briefly this idea of modes of hearing and listening, which is sort of a, you know, kind of philosophical, sociological kind of topic that others have broached. And then we have a history of autistic hearing, which I think is quite interesting. I'll keep it as brief as possible, but it is kind of a curious historical arc, you might say. Then I'll sort of, in re-theorizing autistic hearing, I'm going to provide a critique of the sort of theories that are out there and sort of postulate a couple other ideas that may be sort of more better suited towards the evidence. Then explore some further theories that are maybe less well supported by evidence, but still I think have sort of tantalizing implications if you sort of want to follow up with them. And then examples of lived experience. So how is this thinking about more about how autistic hearing might be sort of manifest and sort of how can we identify it through the musicking and the talk about music among autistic people. So yeah, so starting off with modes of hearing. So when I speak of autistic hearing as a mode of hearing, I am drawing upon a sociological and philosophical tradition that has theorized the nature of hearing and listening. Hearing in this sense, is not simply raw auditory processing, but refers to the multifaceted way in which we perceive and experience sound. And so, as examples right here, and I'm going to come back to some of these later on. So keep these in the back of your head if you can. But so one of these kind of one of the most influential kind of modes are talked about by Pierre Schaeffer. It's really kind of drawing on a phenomenological tradition. So he has these four modes, which are he is written in French, so he has these words right here, italics, which are his words, and then we have kind of a translation here. So we have causal listening, which is like listening to identify a source of the sound, like what is making that sound. Semantic listening, which is sort of like what is the meaning of that sound in terms of words, and verbal communication. Reduced listening, which is listening to the listening to the sound itself and trying to sort of discern its properties. And then hearing, which is more sort of like background hearing, which is not attentive listening per se, but is sort of us processing the sounds around us, even if we're not sort of focused on it. So this is sort of an example of what we're talking about, like modes of hearing. These are sort of like, so these are sort of phenomenological modes. We also have this idea of adequate listening by Ola Stockfelt. And she posits that this is kind of a skill whereby, quote, one masters and develops the ability to listen for what is relevant to the genre in the music, what is adequate to understand according to the specific genre's comprehensible context. And this is comprehensible context. So this is conditioned by, socio-cultural positions, kind of coming out of maybe, work of Pierre Bourdieu. We have these sort of dispositions that have been, kind of created by our surroundings and environment. And these kind of will, give us the listening skills to appreciate certain kinds of music, right? So like now that I'm in Mississippi, lots more people listen to country music, right? Just that'd be sort of a very glib example, but example of how relative sort of cultural, social position will sort of determine the possibility of appreciating genres. So, all right, a couple other sort of concepts right here. We have Jean-Luc Nancy, who's really, I write philosophy, but also sort of Lacanian psychoanalysis. He writes about a resonant subject, and really Nancy is kind of interested in how subjectivity is kind of formed, the identity of a self is kind of formed through kind of experiencing other things outside the self that they share a form, structure, or movement with the self. So in that sense, the idea of like resonance, like a particular kind of movement, music will resonate with me. I'm a resonant subject with that music because it shares some kind of form or structure, movement, meaning, something like that. So it's another mode. And then lastly, we have Joseph N. Strauss here. who we'll talk a little bit more later, but he's really contextualizing modes of listening using disability studies. So his interest in, he has these categories of normal hearing, disabled hearing, and autistic hearing. But he talks about normal hearing, which is really sort of when researchers do cognitive tests, they kind of assume a kind of normal subject, one who is maybe neurotypical, right? Who's kind of normal embodiment. Oftentimes it's going to be, like college students, whoever's available to take these, kind of laboratory tests in terms of, auditory, musical cognition, things like that. So Strauss sort of stakes out what is disabled hearing. He suggests, quote, philosophers like George Lakoff and Mark Johnson have persuaded us that we use our direct, concrete, physical knowledge of our own bodies as a basis for understanding the world around us. Our knowledge of the world is embodied. Differences in human embodiment, physical, psychological, cognitive, and intellectual differences play a significant role in the ways people make sense of their world, including their musical world. So in this sense, we have these different kinds of modes here. So disabled hearing and autistic hearing would be sort of a subcategory of that. Well, these are kind of theoretical constructs, and we'll come back to these in a little bit. So now we'll get on to autistic hearing, a history. And I think it's kind of very interesting, especially in the early years of autism research, which would be, kind of considered like the 1940s and 50s. Leo Kanner, whose paper, Autistic Disturbances of Affective Content, he interestingly is sort of cited often as, the first sort of published scholarship that really sort of puts autism as we sort of understand it today on the map, even though there are many differences of our and Kanner's. This is kind of like considered like the landmark publication of that marks the modern sort of autistic scholarship on autism. And Kanner, in this landmark study, he talks about the music listening, autistic hearing aspects of 6 out of his 11 subjects. So even in the very first piece of scholarship on what we might consider on autism, we see this idea that autism affects one's hearing, and one's relationship to music is already present, right? It's already present in the moment of this first this study. And later on, we'll find like Louise Despert and Albert Sherwin as well. You can see right here, kind of diving into the topic a little bit more in depth. So we can see, this is sort of like the earliest attempts. And so these early studies establish a link of autism to hearing and listening to music, identify heightened capacity for sensory perception and absorption. They note strengths in memory, specific kind of tendencies and how they're performing to music and listening to music, and explore how deficits in abstract thinking could affect ability to conceptualize musical form. So these are sort of some of the earliest sort of attempts to think about autistic hearing. And what ends up happening is there is this kind of rich little tradition that was developed in the earliest years, but most of it was done by researchers who had sort of conceptualized autism through a psychoanalytic lens. And what ends up happening is there's this sort of theory, this early theory of autistic hearing that is based on, this idea that autism is caused by caregivers who are cold and unemotive, and and then this kind of like causes a infantile trauma that is sort of borne out later as sort of autism. And this is famously referred to as the refrigerator mother kind of theory. And this ends up being pretty much discredited and thrown in the wastebasket of history, I guess you could say. In the sort of 60s and 70s, when there's sort of more, more scientific studies on sort of the nature of autism. But in that process, the interest in autistic hearing really diminishes, right? Autistic hearing as sort of like a mode of hearing, as we talked about before. And really what happens is there's a huge increase in really, like auditory processing studies among autistic subjects, neuroscientific advances, and also interest in autistic savants as well, right? So, so you have kind of like a scientific regime that kind of takes over and kind of squeezes out what was kind of interesting scholarship on autistic hearing, autistic music making in the earliest days, but it was at the same time it was kind of wildly it was based on this wildly inaccurate theory. So anyway, from the 60s and 70s, so we find a lot more studies on things like auditory memory, perceptual constancy, auditory brainstem responses, and hemispheric lateralization, auditory pattern detection, and hyper and hyposensory capacity. So this is sort of like the inauguration of really sort of more scientific understanding of listening and hearing among autistic subjects, but a sort of abandonment of the sort of philosophical idea of autistic hearing. And this really kind of holds for a good 40 years until we have these studies in the mid to late 2000s, which kind of kick off again this interest in autistic hearing. And so here we have those studies right here. We have Dave Headlam, John Kochavi, and Joseph Strauss. Strauss's first publication on this was 2009, actually. He sort of later refined it later in his book, Extraordinary Measures. So actually, it's really like from 2006 to 2009. I think it's a kind of interesting emergence of kind of reigniting the interest in autistic hearing. And what I would say is that really the significance is that instead of sort of approaching it with a psychoanalytic lens, these scholars replaced that sort of psychoanalysis with, we might say, neurodiversity, the concept of neurodiversity as sort of the theoretical frame to which they're going to approach the issue. So, and so as far as the concept of neurodiversity, this, we can maybe say it's sort of slowly emerging in the 1980s and 90s autism rights movement. And probably the term neurodiversity, I think it's first published in this essay by Judy Singer, Why Can't You Be Normal Once in Your Life? There's some people who will debate whether it's sort of coined earlier by different advocates, certainly possible, but Singer is sort of the sort of first published version of that that I think is out there. And I think, Jim Sinclair's Don't Mourn for Us, he really lays out what a lot of neurodiversity advocacy, autism advocacy, kind of lays out a lot of the principles, I think, that have been picked up by people and carried on and developed further. But so I'll read this quote, I think, because this is, I think it's a powerful quote that is sort of underlies a lot of what's come since. So autism isn't something that a person has or a shell that a person is trapped inside. There's no normal child that is hidden behind the autism. Autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colors every experience, sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter. Every aspect of existence. It is not possible to separate the autism from the person. And if it were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with. So this is kind of a seminal essay and quote that has really reverberated since then. Okay, so that's kind of like the history, and now we'll get into the theories of autistic hearing. First off, Dave Headlam suggests sort of that because absolute pitch is more prevalent among autistic subjects in certain trials, autistic listeners are drawn to music where non-hierarchical network type relations predominate, such as atonal music. And this is sort of like because they're focused on absolute pitch, sort of like being able to isolate a pitch and identify it individually. suggests there's a kind of focus on this individual event rather than the context of that event with the sort of surrounding events. And I think this idea is picked up and further developed, I think more clearly at least, by Joe Strauss. And Joe Strauss is the theory that I'm going to dig into the most. It's the most elaborate, and I think kind of like the most well, well known. So anyhow, so for Strauss, he expands Headlam's theory and, as I mentioned before, sort of contrasts normative embodiment with disabled hearing, and he applies cognitive theories that were developed in the 1980s and 90s, sort of about autistic cognition, and he sort of applies them, and he sort of filters them through a neurodiversity lens, you might say, and then speculates how they would affect listening to music. And those theories are weak central coherence, theory of mind, and executive functioning. So let's see here. Oops. Okay. So the first one, sort of suggests, again, absolute pitch is auditory evidence of a sort of weak central coherence kind of cognitive style. And, so from a sort of medical model perspective, Strauss says weak central coherence is an atypically weak tendency to bind local details into global wholes, or an underlying inability to create larger meanings of patterns from discrete elements. And this is sort of translated, right? Trying to take a deficit and turn it into a strength, suggests so objects are comprehended in their full discrete and concrete individuality rather than as members or representatives of a larger subsuming abstract category. So this is kind of like the first stage. Then second stage, so theory of mind, which was sort of described, at least by Strauss, as from a medical perspective, sort of a deficit in the ability to attribute intentions, knowledge, and feelings to other people. And instead, he suggests that theory of mind sort of results in a cognitive style that where locally coherent, quote, locally coherent networks of private associations are privileged rather than shared meanings. So if we sort of combine this idea of theory of mind and weak central coherence, he writes, so instead of hierarchy, autistic hearing involves the creation of associative networks. Individual events are not so much clumped together to create patterns as they are appreciated both for their own sake and for the associations they may evoke in relation to other events. And then lastly, right here, the third theory is executive functioning, or executive dysfunctioning, if you want to phrase it like that. But Strauss sort of frames the medical version as difficulties in modulating mental focus or shifting attention easily from task to task. And Strauss sort of reinterprets this as having fixity of focus. So, sort of hyper-focused capacities, which could result in prodigious rote memory, preference for repetition, and gift for mimesis. And similar to Headlam, Strauss sort of argues that the autistic hearing is more apt to appreciate modernist atonal music, and normal hearing is more sort of suited for tonal music, and elaborates on that further. But
John, excuse me, John. What is
yep.
mimesis? What is mimesis?
Mimesis is imitation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Imitation. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Yeah. So, and as a sort of example, so Strauss does give us an example of what he thinks is somebody who is performing a sense of autistic hearing, right? So the idea is, if we hear music a certain way, then we're going to perform music a certain way that is reflective of how we hear. And Strauss talks about, uses Glenn Gould as an example. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Glenn Gould, but he's a very famous pianist in the classical tradition, from around 1955 to 1982, I think is the bulk of his creative output. And this is something that is, I think, we can say is a little bit questionable or not, depending on your perspective. But the idea of retro-diagnosing a famous musical performer as autistic, you can see that there can be issues there. But with Gould, in the case of Gould, there's certainly a lot of social and communicative tendencies, which would suggest could be on the spectrum. And he also demonstrated a bunch of sort of sensory abnormalities as well. So there's a kind of cottage industry of retro-diagnosing historical figures as autistic. Some of them I think are really kind of awful, or really kind of a stretch. In Glenn Gould's case, I think there's a case to be made, but that can be debated. So anyway, but Strauss uses Gould as an example, and Gould has a very sort of particular style of playing piano. So his persistent staccato articulation represents a preference for extreme isolation of individual tone. The detachment of lines from other lines and notes from other notes is a striking musical affirmation of an autistic preference for local coherence. And if you're unfamiliar with Gould, he's a big J.S. Bach enthusiast. And so I think this is just a good example of that sort of detached staccato articulation that Strauss feels is representative of autistic hearing. Okay. So that's kind of where I'll stop there in terms of just reviewing the theories of autistic hearing as they were articulated in the in the scholarship I cited. And I'd like to first start by sort of noting some issues that I think should be considered. So first of all, absolute pitch certainly seems more prevalent in autism among autistic people than neurotypical, but the degree to which it can be representative or sort of use an example of representing autism, I think is kind of a very problematic issue, because I mean, there are numerous studies out there that will sort of attempt to analyze what percentage of autistic individuals possess absolute pitch. I would say the most convincing ones I would say are maybe 5%, 1 out of 20. I found that to be most convincing. There is I won't mention the name, but there's a piece of scholarship that defines absolute pitch so broadly that they find 97% of autistic individuals have absolute pitch. I think that was a very flawed study that doesn't really jibe with my real world experience of, and I think there are issues. So I would say it's a low percent, but still it's quite much higher. If in normal population it might be 1 in 10,000, right? Then 5% is quite a bit more, but still doesn't really represent the whole population, right? It's still a slim minority of that. So that's one issue. A couple of the other issues where Strauss and Headlam are kind of making assumptions about how you can skills in tendencies in language can be sort of applied to music. And as we all know, there are plenty of people who are quite gifted in music and not in language, and vice versa. So you can't really make any assumptions regarding if someone has a skill in language, it's necessarily transferable to music. So that's another issue. Another one you find is that each of them suggests that autistic listeners will prefer repetition, but also that they are interested in local coherence. So if local coherence is interested in an individual sound event, then having a preference for repetition is actually contradictory, because preferring repetition suggests you are interested in how music is grouped, right? How that sound event is grouped and relates to other sound events around it, right? So if you prefer repeated things, that's a kind of a formal preference and not a interest in the sort of individual isolated event. And then sort of more broadly, Headlam and Strauss, Kochavi to a certain extent as well, they ignore a lot of scientific research on the auditory processing involving autistic subjects. And this is something that has been accumulating, right, since the 60s and 70s. So there's like a whole lot more information that they just kind of decided to ignore and just kind of create a theoretical version of it. And then lastly, they fail to include sort of lived experiences of autistic subjects, which, if you follow aspects of the neurodiversity movement, autism rights, that's a kind of key stipulation. You know, if you're kind of doing it right, you want to be interrogating the specific experiences of autistic people if you want to learn more about them. So anyway, that's kind of like a list of sort of issues that sort of crop up in their research. And I guess the first thing we'd like to do is talk about this idea of weak central coherence, which is sort of central to Headlam and Strauss's claims. And there are a bunch of studies that show that the theory of weak central coherence really does not apply to auditory perception with autistic subjects. So, for instance, the isolated individual event that Strauss is interested in, I mean, would suggest that like the ability to perceive melodic contour would be diminished. So you'd be able to sort of, it's a kind of gestalt, right? It's a kind of combination of individual events that create a larger pattern. And there's no difference among autistic subjects in this. Disembedding, that's sort of the ability to remove and insert pitches within chords, right? So the ability to conceive of an individual tone as belonging to a larger category, like a C major 7 chord or something like that, right? There's no noticeable differences there as well. Harmonic progressions, there are not too many studies on this, but it seems like there's no differences in that as well. And then melodic construction, taking like two halves of a melody and figuring out which halves sort of fit together. Again, there's sort of no real differences among autistic and neurotypical subjects. So that sort of puts a big dent, and I think in a lot of what they're sort of arguing. And there's this other theory, I think, which sort of came after weak central coherence, but it seems much more appropriate and more evidence-based, and that is by Laurent Matron et al. They have this theory of enhanced perceptual functioning, and this is where there's enhanced processing of elementary physical properties of incoming stimuli. So this would be like the quality of the sound, right? The pitch and the timbre, these sort of properties that are come from the sound. There's a heightened degree of attention to these elements. So this is kind of like a rival theory. And so if we look at this sort of evidence about this enhanced perceptual functioning, we'll find, so on the one hand, pitch memory it seems like there are individual autistic subjects who demonstrate very strong pitch memory. But it's still a fairly low percentage of the overall autistic population. So, so in some cases, if it's a small sample size, there's going to maybe a bigger effect on, sort of this idea of pitch memory. But generally speaking, it's not sort of shared by the bulk of the population. However, if you look at tasks such as pitch discrimination, there are many studies that sort of show that this is an area where the enhanced perceptual functioning seems to be actually quite appropriate to say. So pitch discrimination is basically the ability to determine the difference between two tones. And that might be, you might think that's easy if it's if it's a fifth, right? But it could be a microtone, it could be smaller than a semitone. So there are a whole bunch of studies that are analyzing if autistic and neurotypical subjects can determine like the differences between tones, right? In these pitch discrimination. And sometimes there's also a test where there's a high pitch and a low pitch, and then they converge, and then the subject has to identify when are the two pitches equal, right? So it's like a seesaw kind of a thing there. And so all these studies show, autistic subjects actually outperform the neurotypical subjects. So this is a good data point for enhanced perceptual functioning. The other sort of field that I think there's pretty strong evidence is regarding temporal perception, right? So if pitch and timbre are sort of one sphere, right, of music, then time and rhythm is another. And here it seems that autistic subjects perform inconsistently, below neurotypical kind of results. And there's no single test, I don't think, similar to pitch discrimination, that provides that's kind of like the smoking gun, I guess you could say, that would provide incontrovertible evidence. But there are a lot of sort of related tests, and I list some of them right here: gap detection, diachronic thinking, time estimation, temporal order, and all of them sort of demonstrate results below level. And there is a scholar named Melissa Ullman who actually has she calls it a temporal deficit hypothesis of autism. It's pretty interesting idea, where she's sort of suggesting that a deficit in temporal perception can actually underlie a lot of what we might think of as sort of typical, deficits in sort of, as they're sort of pointed out in DSM literature. For instance, like social interaction and communication could be, there's a temporal deficit that could impact that. If there's kind of motor development, right? If you're not perceiving time accurately, that would also affect that. So it's a pretty interesting theory. It was established, maybe she wrote about it maybe 10 years ago. And I think, I don't know, I'd be interested in maybe shooting her an email and seeing where that is at at this stage. I don't, there's no real theory of autism that encompasses everything, but I think it's a tantalizing little nugget there. So anyhow, I would just like to quickly show my work a little bit, and this is from my dissertation, where just basically trying to review as many of these studies as possible. These are the sort of pitch memory tests. I have 5 studies there. And then we have sort of pitch discrimination tests coming here. And I have, I think, maybe 15 studies that I looked at for pitch discrimination. And then temporal perception, I have, I think, 14 studies that I looked at. So, these are, this is a humanities dissertation. So if I were to describe this literature review, I would say, I just found as many articles on the topics and analyzed them as best I could. I think there could be a more sort of systematic way of doing it, but I felt like I was pretty thorough and amassed quite a bit of info about this. So that's kind of why I would sort of conclude here that we have this strength in pitch and this deficit in time as sort of global results when you study. So if we want to think about sort of how that applies, or what are the what is an analog for that, we could think about vision, right? This is also sort of a feature we'll find, that when looking at a stationary object, autistic vision appears to be enhanced, and when the object is moving, the perception appears to be diminished, right? So if it's sort of atemporal, if it's outside of any sort of time constraints, the perception is stronger in sort of the visual domain. Whereas if it's moving space over time, then there's a sort of a deficit. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is when we look at language. There are sort of tests that show that autistic subjects show enhanced perception of speech pitched, but diminished language processing, right? So the idea is when I'm talking, if I'm talking in a scale, then I'm going back down, right? So the idea is an autistic listener may be focused more on the rise and fall of the pitches than the actual speech content, right? The semantic sort of content. And if we think about that, going back to Pierre Schaeffer, right? We had sort of these different forms of listening. So that would sort of suggest that semantic listening is sort of displaced in favor of reduced listening, if we want to use these kind of phenomenological categories, right? The listening for meaning is sort of diminished, whereas the properties of the sound in terms of the speech is sort of enhanced. So I personally, I come up with a name. I say, I call it spectral hearing. If you have this sort of this idea of a combination of enhanced pitch perception and inconsistent temporal perception, just basically the idea is of a imbalance of what is being focused on, and so spectral hearing is kind of like my term that I like to use to sort of to refer to this kind of imbalance. And I'd like to draw upon this study by first off is Anjali Batara, but it's also it's co-authored by Daniel Levitin. So if you know him, the well-known sort of music perception, music psychology researcher. I think this is a really interesting study to think about in terms of spectral hearing. And the study itself is actually interested in looking at emotion perception among autistic listeners. But I'm going to sort of reinterpret the results a little bit. Take a little bit of liberty with the results to sort of recontextualize it in terms of what we know about pitch and time. So for this study, he has these versions of Chopin piano music, and basically digitally manipulates the piano music to a certain degree. So on the one hand, one is just a performance by a pianist, and then they reduce the expressive elements by these various degrees, right? So it can be 0%, 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100%, which is kind of like completely mechanical, you might say. There's no expressive elements at all. And then a randomized version also. So that just is, each tone could be randomly assigned a value. And I'll play examples of these. So listeners were asked to listen to these and determine which is the most sort of expressive, right? Which has the kind of emotional content that is most recognizable. So here is the sort of normal version, 100% expressive. All right, and then this is the sort of mechanical version of it. You get the idea, and here's the randomized version. So I'll go on there. Hopefully you got the picture. So the results of this are, so the neurotypical group, unsurprisingly, picks the first recording we heard, right, as the most expressive. But the autistic group found all versions equally expressive. And while the conclusion here in this study was sort of that there's like an impairment in identifying, emotional content, right, in sort of as found in sort of these expressive qualities of the music. Um, that was sort of this conclusion, but I'm sort of going to reinterpret it in a sort of different way and suggest that really, I mean, the degree to which we can assess whether each version is actually expressive or not really is in the ear of the beholder, right? Like, if somebody locates the sort of emotional core of the music as simply in the sort of pitch-based relationships, then each of the versions itself would be, each of the versions individually would be equally expressive, right? The idea that the music necessarily has to have this perpetual rubato, that is very famous in Chopin music, right? And early 19th century romantic piano music in general, right? The idea that that is necessarily an indicator of emotion, I think, could be a little bit misguided, right? Instead, we might think of, we don't want to necessarily assume that there's less ability to interpret music as emotional. Maybe it's just different aspects of the music itself are containing that emotion. And if it's the sort of pitch-based aspects of the music, then all these versions would be equally expressive. If you want to just listen again to an example, this would be again 100% expressive. So let's just try to think of that. Let's just, as a thought experiment or a listening experiment, think about this next one and see if we can hear it that way, right? So. Right, and here's the 0%. Okay, next stop there. So if we return to Glenn Gould, which, if we want to sort of continue with this kind of thought experiment where Glenn Gould is our kind of a virtuoso autistic listener, and that autism is manifest in his performance. The idea that this staccato articulation as sort of isolating sounds doesn't really make much sense, given that there isn't really any indication that is any sort of aspect of autistic hearing, that it would be sort of isolating individual sound events like that. Especially also if you end up reading a lot of what Glenn Gould writes about, he's actually quite obsessed with musical structure and performing in a way that brings out those sort of structural elements of the music. But rather, if we think of as the style having a rigid tempi and extremely consistent articulation, it's really more like he's creating this scaffolding by which we can most clearly hear the sort of pitched aspects of the music and the sort of counterpoint and harmony and melodies sort of interweaving in the sort of the most clear sort of sense, right? So, and here we have, Glenn Gould was not particularly fond of Chopin, but he did record this one B minor sonata. But here we can hear sort of, again, it's really kind of the same sort of translation that we heard in the study by Batara and Levitin, but this is really kind of like an enacted version of it. So the first one we'll hear a version by Lang Lang, the well-known concert pianist, contemporary, and then Glenn Gould's sort of version of Chopin. So when we can hear Gould's version is kind of reminiscent of what we heard with the study. cooled. Okay, so hopefully you can hear that analogy, right, that we're trying to point out here. So again, that's not isolating events, but it's reducing the amount of these we might think of as maybe for a spectral listener, right, trying to reduce maybe these sort of temporal complexities, right, this sort of tug and pull that might sort of distract from what we might think of as sort of the core from a spectral, the core sort of aesthetic component of the piece from a spectral listener, which would be the sort of these sort of pitch relationships, hearing each individual voice articulated cleanly. Um, so that's kind of an example of, we'll talk about spectral hearing. There are other modes of hearing that I think are worthy of investigation as well, that can kind of give us insights into autistic hearing. One is sort of a field called auditory scene analysis, and is famously known as sort of a cocktail party problem. And the idea that people are trying to solve is, how is it when we're at a cocktail party and there are 100 people in the room and everybody's talking? How is it that we can filter out the voices of everybody surrounding us and focusing on the person in front of us and identifying what that person is saying without sort of it blending into this sort of mass of this kind of mass of voices. And so generally speaking, in these sort of kinds of analyses or trials, we'll find that autistic subjects demonstrate inconsistent ability in tasks regarding auditory stream segregation, which is sort of the mechanism that we can use to filter sounds and isolate sounds to focus on them. And especially sort of complex textures, sort of auditory textures are going to be less comprehensible than sort of clear, simple ones. So this is sort of, again, this is not as much, not so much evidence for this, but this is sort of, I think, emerging issues. There's also this issue of emotional responsivity, and there's sort of some evidence, not overwhelming, but that autistic responses to music are often going to be sort of found along this polarity of exhilaration and calmness, which is almost more sort of like an autonomic response than sort of emotional responses to the music, like identifying specific kinds of emotions. And so, and this is done through, I think there's like a skin conductivity test and some other sort of questionnaires. But the idea is, so music is kind of something that is going to rev up your body, right? It's going to sort of animate, but it's for an autistic listener, but maybe less so in terms of identifying specific emotions. So yeah, it's just minimal or some indications that this might be the case. And then there's still, I guess, the issue of form, which I'm kind of going to return to. And we talked about the individual event, which I think, generally speaking, is prioritizing the individual event is not particularly relevant, because it seems like autistic listeners will cognize intervals, melodies, chords, chord progressions easily. But there might be issues in terms of linking relationships between sort of different systems, auditory systems across time, right? And there's something called a temporal binding hypothesis. So temporal binding within local networks, such as like a melody, for instance, might appear intact or enhanced compared to controls, but temporal binding between local networks appears diminished compared to control. So maybe relating a melody across time to a different section of a piece or something like that could be more of a difficulty. And this, I think there's evidence in terms of neurologic evidence that suggests, there's sort of some very sort of powerfully tightly clustered neural regions that operate very well among autistic people, but also that sometimes connections between those regions and other regions can be can be slower than normal. So so I guess I try to lay out. So other possible modes of hearing, so texture attuned to the sequential over the simultaneous, attuned to the sparse and simple over dense and complex. Emotion, music serves to modulate energy rather than elicit emotions. And form, small scale structures are comprehensible. Music meaning derived from a sequence association rather than development over time. So blocks of music have these kind of meanings, but not necessarily extended over sequence of time, which is somewhat similar to how Strauss writes about the power of sort of association, association being sort of the driver of form. Um, so I thought just an example of what I think about, I think sort of demonstrates this kind of unique approach to form is from a case study of mine during my Nordhoff Robbins training. And this client is very skilled, probably consider a savant, but he had a very sort of interesting sort of use of form in his playing, and he would sort of have these melodies. I think he picked them up from the television, you know, and he kind of play them in very interesting kind of sequences, and not necessarily how I would, you know, play if I were to, you know, improvise with other people. This is not necessarily how I would do it, but he'd sort of just take a block of music and sort of transpose it up and down, and that's kind of the action of the music, right? It's just like these juxtaposed blocks or themes. So here's the first theme, which I call a sports theme. Actually, I haven't ever figured out what it is. To me, it sounds like it may be like a March Madness jingle or something like that. Maybe somebody knows what it is. But anyway, here's the sports theme, and you can hear its sort of manipulations. So again, just kind of transposing this idea. And then secondly, so as you know, therapist, my goal was in the Nordhoff Robbins training, at least, was to identify these sort of fragments or sort of blocks and try to turn them into some kind of interactive event, you know, some kind of back and forth exchange. So here we have, you know, our client right here. He's going to introduce the T-Mobile jingle, and if we're both playing piano here, so he's the pianist who's virtuosic. I'm kind of the I'm the accompanist who's just trying to keep up, basically. But you can hear we're sort of doing a transition. We're doing a cadence, sort of a flat 6, flat 7, 1 major cadence, and then he's going to introduce this T-Mobile motive. That's right. So we have a little bugle call there at the end. So again, trying to incorporate these segments into interactive sections. And then here again we have we're sort of I'm accompanying him playing a blues sort of progression, and then the client will introduce his McDonald's melody right here, and then again we try to sort of transition into an interactive exchange. So hopefully that's a example of form. I would like to, I guess, bring up another aspect of my research that I'm, pursuing, and I would say it's my basically is my own personal relationship to autistic hearing. I was diagnosed on the spectrum as an adult, um, and I've sort of been thinking a lot. As I studied this and learned about it, I was trying to think about as well as my sort of own relationship to music and how sort of differences that I may not have noticed at certain points in my life maybe influenced the types of music I made, the types of choices I made, what I liked and what I didn't like. Um, and so and I do kind of identify as a someone who was always in ear training classes, very good at pitch relationships, and had trouble sort of in sort of different temporal tasks and things like that. Playing sort of different rhythmic ideas, and I really been kind of analyzing what I'd say my sort of own experience of listening to heavy metal. Heavy metal was probably the music that caused me to get a guitar and start learning music and pursuing a life of making music. And so there is a sort of I guess a special place in my heart for heavy metal music. And when I sort of analyze it, and this is not true of all subgenres of heavy metal, which there are many, but it's sort of classic aesthetics of heavy metal. I kind of noticed all these features, which sort of all kind of flow into what I would think of as aspects of autistic hearing that I have sort of laid out before. So, I mean, on the one hand, the sort of singular defining maybe characteristic of heavy metal is this distorted guitar, right? This distorted electric guitar and power chords. And for myself at least, I've played plenty of power chords. I've listened to them for many years, but still, if I hear one, it kind of lights my nerves on fire in a certain way. It's a very sort of my back straightens up, and a very effective thing that I cannot simply kind of like refuse my attention to. It's a very distinct kind of a sound, and it's has this extremely rich, if we analyze sort of the timbral and spectral components of it, right? It's amplifying all these partials, and it kind of creating this really sort of powerful, interesting kind of synthesis of sort of frequencies and sounds. So, and at the same time, it has this sort of very alluring spectral content, and heavy metal is pretty, classically at least, very pretty rudimentary rhythm, right? Kind of perpetual motion, you might say, bum 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 bum, right? It has sort of fast kind of fast, simple rhythms. And so to me, for me, that's very sort of accommodating, right? It's sort of very inviting because my sort of temporal issues all sort of melt away, and the music, when played loudly, kind of carries my body along with it. And it sort of diminishes things that are weak, and it sort of offers me things to attend to where I'm strong. So, and other sort of aspects of it, it's very simple texturally, right? There's actually not really chords. It's really just kind of like a bass and a treble. If you consider the sort of power chord as sort of a singular kind of a sonority. So it's kind of very simple texturally, sort of emotionally as well. Like I'll be the first to admit the lyrics can be pretty silly, but they're not really that significant, right? They may index a sort of feeling or a um, you know image, but not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily have that sort of nuanced emotional expression. And then also form, right? It's sort of repetitive block-like form, modular form, it's sort of analyzed as well. So that's sort of another aspect that I think all sort of flows into what I've been talking about. And this kind of harkens back to what I talked about with Adequate Listening by Ola Stockfelt, right? So depending on your sort of neurodevelopment and your sort of perceptual orientation, not so much as sort of socio-cultural position, unless you want to consider autism as a sort of cultural identity, which you can as well. But we can kind of see how there's kind of like certain kind of genres and styles that are, they make themselves available to me in a accommodating manner. So anyway, that's my little bit on heavy metal. I'm going to skip this last one. Um, oh, sorry. And go to the conclusion. And I should also mention, it's another, there's sort of a whole bunch of avenues to look at lived experience. I'm currently working with a project led by Ken Agan, we have a bunch of um, interviews about their kind of musical experience, autistic interviewees describing that. So that's another really, I think hopefully that will um, emerge as a really valuable sort of source of information. So more, lived experience, getting into that sort of verbally, but hopefully I'll show that the case study, right, that lived experience is not just people telling you what it is, but it's actual musicking, right? It's people making music and us sort of understanding how that music might be reflective of a different way of hearing. So as a summary, autistic hearing is a useful concept that has a long history. Recent theories by Headlam, Strauss, and Kochavi reignite the scholarly pursuit. Theories can be sharpened through critique, considerations of studies in auditory processing, examining lived experience of autistic subjects. And then here's the caveat, of course, is that hearing types are not universal and can develop in many ways. So, hopefully nobody comes away with this thinking that all autistic people have a spectral hearing. That's definitely not what I'm trying to argue, right? I'm suggesting more that enough members of the autism population may demonstrate spectral hearing such that it may have an effect size on these kind of clinical trials, right? So it's certainly not like a universal kind of characteristic, but it's something that is present and it should be sort of noticeable, right? And it's present enough, unlike say absolute pitch, which is really kind of a minority, slim minority who may sort of demonstrate this. But it's these sort of hearing types, such as spectral hearing, is common enough so that it is sort of making a dent in these clinical trials, and so that's why it's important. And so finally, an awareness of different possible modes of hearing allows us to better understand our clients' life worlds, right? So and again, hopefully when you're as a music therapist, right, you're assessing your clients and you're going in with a fairly blank slate, right? You don't want to make any kind of assumptions about what, given what their diagnosis is, what they might be experiencing. It's very kind of can be heterogeneous, right? But at the same time, if this is something that you're working with somebody and this pops up as a potential feature of perception that they may have and influences their musicality and their hearing and listening, then it would be quite valuable to have these kind of modes and understand how somebody may partake in this way of listening, so that we can kind of contextualize it and understand it, understand the possible ways it can develop and how it might affect their life world, right? The way they experience the world and music. So I guess I went a little bit over, but I think we still definitely have time for questions. So thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you so much, John. There's so much to unpack there in that presentation, and let's open it up to questions for anybody. Maybe John, we can stop sharing the slide so we can see everybody.
Okay.
That'd be great.
I stopped screen sharing.
Yeah, stop screen sharing.
Okay. Let's see.
Oh, yeah,
Let's see here. Oops.
should be just on top.
Oh, stop share. Gotcha.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll kick it off. John, I wonder, based upon your experience and the research that you've done, what role does emotionality and rubato and all those things play in music when considering music for people on the spectrum? Do you have anything to share about emotionality in music?
Hmm. Well, I mean, again, let's see. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, emotionality, especially for those on the spectrum, maybe things that they feel are not always going to be expressed in the ways we expect them to be expressed. So, which is why sort of, when I discussed the Batara and Levitin study, I wanted to sort of clarify that, you know, just because there's what people are describing certain kind of music as all as emotionally expressive, that doesn't necessarily entail a deficit in emotion recognition, but maybe what is considered emotional is going to be different according to their perspective, or it's going to be expressed differently. Um, but yeah, so that's I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But I don't want to make any overly broad generalizations. But it's always to make sure we're reminded that sometimes a facial expression is not exactly the most reliable, when or what we expect to be reliable among one population versus an autistic population. It could be a different kind of form of expression, and the emotion could be there. Maybe the words aren't there, or the facial expression isn't there, but we want to make sure to give the benefit of the doubt, to allow the possibility that it could be just not manifest as we're used to seeing it.
Mm, yeah. And I think, that study about, yeah, about music being activating, right? But not necessarily emotionally activating. Not that we can't label sad or happy necessarily, but it doesn't mean that that music isn't activating something and stimulating someone and energizing them. And that's another aspect of emotionality too. So I think when you're energized, that can be considered emotional. So
Yeah.
things are coming through the chat. Um, Konomi writes, that was a wonderful presentation, John. If you could share us your slide or this recording through the email, she has to go back to work. Oh, she's very far away. Okay, thank you, Konomi. So I'm not sure about sharing your slides, John. That's up to you. Um,
Okay. Yeah. If you can always, I think there should be. If you could share my email, that'll be perfectly fine.
okay, okay.
Definitely. Yeah.
Jillian, hi Jillian, would like you to play the example that you skipped.
Oh,
Yeah,
of Eric Satie.
yeah.
You want me to play it?
What's the rationale? What's the reasoning behind having Sati? What was that slide
Well,
based on?
okay. So Satie is kind of another figure who, similar to Glenn Gould, I think people have started to write about as possibly being on the spectrum. And again, he's a little bit of a past generation. So again, it's there's less evidence, I guess you could say, in terms of being able to analyze. But I think it's probably the one composer who we might be able to assign that. So the slide I had was one of his pieces titled Ogives, and it is it's a very, and if you know Satie, you'll know he has very kind of interesting choices in terms of what is repeated and what is I think he has a piece where you're supposed to repeat a phrase like 1,000 times or something like that. I can't remember the number. That's kind of like a joke, kind of considered a joke piece, but maybe also be indicative. But these pieces, Ogives, which is one of his earlier pieces, it's just basically it's a melody played in octaves, and then it's just repeated, played sort of with a similar harmony. And I'm just going to use that as an example of, again, sort of this approach to form, this idea of sort of almost like anti-development, but rather kind of juxtaposing these moments or these blocks as that's sort of like the formal procedure or aspect of the music that kind of propels it along. Anyway, that was my idea there. I don't know. I probably would like to do a little bit more research on it and articulate it a little bit more finely than I am right now. But that was just kind of building up on the sort of idea of form, possibility of form being a little bit conceptually different. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have a couple more questions. Thank you for the presentation. Could you give some specific examples of what you mean by differences in the perception of texture parts with different timbres?
Okay, so I mean, I think when I'm talking about texture, I'm talking about like simply the number of voices we might think of in a particular arrangement, right? Like the kind of a either kind of a very dense like fugue you might think of, right, as being like a sort of complex kind of a texture. Although whereas if we have a kind of bass and treble kind of a texture, two voice basically, that would be more of a kind of a simple kind of a texture. Um, and so and again, like for the examples like Chopin, a lot of times those are sort of very heavily pedaled as well, right? Kind of creates well, some will call it a muddy texture, if you prefer sort of a cleaner texture, whereas Gould plays Chopin almost with no pedal, right? So it's kind of like a clean, simpler texture rather than all these voices sort of overlapping and sort of creating this kind of like a sound mass that is more difficult to pick out individual moments of it. So that was it. Was there another part to that? It was texture and
Timbres, the differences between perception of texture and parts with different
yeah,
timbres.
yeah. And so timbre, I mean, again, this is very, I don't know if there's enough evidence to really proclaim this strongly, but it seems that when there's a complex mixture of timbres, um, such as a cocktail party, right? Where vocal timbres are really incredibly complex, and if you layer them on top of each other, that can be like a very difficult to isolate one out of the mass. Whereas if you actually have whereas if the timbres are all identical, like and so they do some like studies with pure tones, it doesn't seem like there's as much or a deficit at all, really, in terms of being able to identify the timbre. So if it's a kind of complex texture with sort of multiple sort of timbres, it seems that's more difficult to perceive than a complex texture with identical timbres or simple texture with few voices. So that's but again, it's I think it's there's I would await more evidence on that.
Okay, thank you. So here's another question. Sarah writes, thank you so much. This was incredibly interesting. Really enjoyed the part focusing on energy changes in the music rather than emotional stimulation. Yes, I agree. Also relating very much with the heavy metal portion, I've seen a pattern of preference to heavy metal in the folks with autism that I work with. Interesting. Sounds like a study there. I see.
Yeah, I would love to figure out how to do a kind of more of a very broad sort of taste preferences. There have been a couple studies, but not too much. But that's something, yeah, I noticed that as well. In my encounters with other people on the spectrum, I've noticed there's great seems like a higher percentage than others, but that's also somewhat anecdotal, so I don't want to.
But I'm interested in the musical form of heavy metal. I would be interested in the musical analysis of what's going on there. I know there are subgenres and everything, but I think there's something there. I do. I mean, I even just from my own listening, I get it in a way. There's repetition. There's a certain twang. Yeah, there's a lot there. Oh, now things are really coming in fast. Okay. Julian, thanks you for talking about the sati. Oh, Suzanne asks, was this the reason for choosing Chopin? As a pianist, this was very interesting. She wanted to know, yeah, why Chopin was chosen as examples. It was as a pianist, this was very interesting to hear the differences.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I can't quite remember exactly the rationale they provide in the study, but it seems to me that if you want to look at these expressive features in terms of tempo and pedaling and these sort of things, then that early 19th century is a really good fertile ground which to look at, because the contrast can be so stark between it when you play it kind of rigidly and expressively, and I think it would, although anyway, yeah, it's also fairly common, I think, composers probably, or performers probably performed, Frescobaldi, like early Baroque music similarly, but it's probably less in people's ear than Chopin. Yeah.
It actually sounded beautiful both ways. Amazingly, I enjoyed both of them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the neurotypical one you usually hear,
Yeah.
but even the one that Gould played, I loved it. Loved
Yeah.
it.
Well, it's a credit to Chopin, really, right? I mean,
Yes, yeah.
music
Yes.
can be performed in many
You
different ways.
wonder.
Yeah. Right.
All right, a couple more things in the chat here. Nick Farr writes, he's happy to see you. Curious about the theory you mentioned of pitch and timbre. Given your findings of a focus on isolation of pitches and timbres, I wonder if this can be tied to sensitivity to these elements to music. I've frequently observed strong sensitivity to timbre of sounds rather than dynamic volume, which is often the first suspect in sensitivity.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and I think it's actually pretty hard to measure how people hear timbre, right? I mean, it seems like pitch, there are frequencies, and we can tell if pitches match or if they don't match. Whereas sensitivity to timbre, we are really kind of, we can tell if a client is particularly drawn to something, right? If we have that instrument in the room, if they respond to it in a certain way. I know I've certainly had that experience where someone's just kind of completely arrested by a sound, and it's like, okay, well, there's something there. Let's work with that. But it's also trickier to sort of quantify and figure out how to study that, I think, formally speaking. Yeah.
Jesse Davis, who's a current graduate student with us, writes, I really enjoyed your mention of heavy metal. I'm thinking about doing my thesis on the perspective of a music therapist on the use of heavy metal in music therapy, as I am a hard rock metal fan myself. There it is. There's a future study. Not based upon autism, but use of this genre in music therapy. So yeah, interesting, very good. And Suzanne wrote again, enjoyed the heavy metal portion too. My son, ADHD diagnosis, loves heavy metal as well. Gives me something to think about. Okay. Yeah. I wonder, from Luke, I wonder what a study would look like with just using power chords as discussed before, leaving out the third, or quality of a chord is really interesting, as I tend to add a lot of extensions to my chords, and this is the opposite. What do you think about that, John?
Yeah, well, and I guess, the kind of, I've been trying to dig into a little bit about the, acoustics of the power chord, and, so some people actually analyze them as actually having many extensions because of all the upper partials are sort of kind of magnified,
Yeah.
But at the same time, I wonder, does it all sound as a single sonority, or is it do we sort of parse those definitions, or is it kind of like a unified? I think I hear it more kind of like as a unified sort of kind of a single sort of a sound. But yeah, and then extensions, for more sort of jazz playing, I guess you could say, definitely would be more common. And I guess, from a music therapy perspective, I always try to consider, I mean, I think this is maybe an issue that crops up in Nora Robbins, because there are quite a number of more complex than Twinkle Twinkle, in terms of the songwriting, using a lot more seventh chords and ninth chords and 11th and 13th, and I think generally, as long as there's a kind of a clear melody, then it certainly can be um, clinically effective. But also, I might question, are they necessary, or could they be a possible distraction depending on the client? Are those extended sonorities kind of um, you know creating more to the texture than maybe they need to be, or maybe they are very appreciated, right? So I think it's definitely an individual choice, or it should be your sort of analysis in the moment as to what is the most appropriate. Yeah.
Mm-mm. Yeah. So, John, I just want to throw this out there. I'm always telling my students, and former students know this too, you probably do too, and I'm probably coining Dr. Margot Eli here, but research is called also me search, right? And I think you're by sharing your own story, we're getting kind of a window into another way that you're able to understand your experience and the experience of others that you've worked with and that you may work with. And so I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that research as me search.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess we're I don't want to speak for everybody, but we're often drawn, to things that are personally motivating, and trying to figure out our own lives, and that certainly happened to me at a point where I kind of look back upon a lot of things I liked and directions I went, and tried to understand why, what was the reason. And of course there are many many mitigating factors, what paths we choose. And but for me, it was really kind of valuable to kind of look at my own musical development and think about this kind of research in that light. Well, at the same time, it can be a little bit, you don't want to that to cloud your judgment as well. You have to be able to step back and try to look at things, um, in as objectively as you can, given all our personal biases that we all have. So yeah.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm in awe that you've chosen to, take this up as a researcher. And it's a risk, and it takes a lot of energy and then self work as well. So it's really kudos to you for diving in there. It's helpful for everybody. Um, we have one more question in the chat and then we'll close it up. How about Disney music with autistic population? Did you see a particular response from them? The T-Mobile ringtone session is great. That was Michi wrote that.
Well, I have to say I haven't studied that in particular, but I would say that I mean, it definitely seems like Disney. I mean, I think there's definitely a strong association, right? And when we see Disney movies at an early age, there's definitely strong attachments, and those attachments may or may not be due to our perceptual orientations, right? So again, like, I don't want to make it seem like our sort of this perceptual way of we experience the world is the only deciding factor in terms of how we are going to listen to music. And if a caregiver sings us a lullaby, we might have a very strong association with that lullaby. It's not, there's plenty of personal reasons why we might be drawn to something. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very complicated. As this
Yeah.
all is. Well, John, I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing this really, really interesting topic that we're all going to continue to think about. And we will look for your writings and research in the future. And I want to thank everybody for being here today. We have such a nice crowd. Obviously, this topic has hit a nerve. So thank you all for joining us. It's so great to see friends and colleagues and former students. So thank you. And stay tuned again for March 31st, which is our next alumni workshop with Solgi Kim coming from Korea. So we'll be talking about multicultural aspects of music therapy in America and Korea, and to look at that. So I hope you'll all join us again for our second alumni workshop. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Take care.